Good morning. It's such a great privilege to be here with you. I wanted to be there in person, but I'm in person. I'm still in person. and I'm here with you. I wanted to read something just strictly right from Ernest Holmes, where he says, one individual with God is a totality, is a completeness. One opinion consistent with the truth is not a positive statement, but an absolute fact. One announcement from the mind that knows will set the world on fire. And then he says, healing is the discovery of the divinity within. I'll never forget when I told Dr. Nelson I wanted him to give 10 talks on the Bible. And I said, I want you to cover the whole Bible. He said, in 10 talks. I said, yes. Well, he's a courageous man, and so that's one of the main lines of his talk. The parables are not moral examples, they're mirrors of identity. And I was talking on that very subject in 1958 when Ernest Holmes walked in. And then after the talk, he came up and they introduced him. And he said, I really enjoyed your talk tonight, Obadiah. It was perfect science of mind. Well, the truth is, I didn't know what science of mind was. And so I didn't know whether to thank him or I said, well, thank you, but I'm not sure I know what that is. And he said, well, I want you to come to Los Angeles, to my seminary, and I'll teach you. Well, I came. It was like a divine command. I really felt that it was a divine order. He certainly set my soul on fire. But, you know, we used to sit in there's a Founders Church at 6th and New Hampshire, I believe. And when they were building that, and the roof was not on, and it was very noisy, all the saws and hammers and so forth. But he wanted me to learn how to meditate in the midst of all the noise. Yeah. And he handed me this little book. It's called Bases of Yoga by Aurobindo. Aurobindo talks about the 4 stages in meditation. First, he says, get a place that is comfortable, sit down, and be quiet. Say nothing. Well, he said, you may hear a barking dog, or a siren, or all the noise outside, but he said, just keep sitting there and staying quiet. And eventually, that which disturbed you before will just fade into the distance. You'll still hear it, but it will be in the distance. And then you know you've touched the level of quiet. Well, then the next phase, he says, if you keep doing that in several days, that quiet will turn to calmness. And then if you keep practicing that meditation, eventually that calmness, and you'll feel the difference, will turn into peace. Then after the peace, he says, you don't have to do anything more. That peace will carry you into silence. Silence is the language of God. Anything else is a bad translation. So I practiced that with Ernest in the church with the ceiling open, and we really demonstrated that fact. You know what Ernest Holmes, in my view, was really trying to do was to give a teaching to the people that would assist them in creating a balance between materiality and spirituality. And he says there's a tendency in the human mind to go to extremes, one to the exclusion of the other. You may start out with that view, but he says eventually one of those views will take the lead. And so, he used to give people money who were researchers. He'd give them money to research for him to bring about that balance between religion and science, or materiality and spirituality. And what he found was that he had to constantly study and research to keep that balance going. You see, the reason for that is this. You can't give your whole self to any teaching unless it satisfies both your reason and your soul. That's what he was after, that balance point. But again, to do that, you have to study all the time. You have to practice all the time. Because, that continuum is constantly switching. And you have to work at it. I'm 85 years old. And I have to study every day, meditate every day. But I like it. And I learn something every day. Yeah. So, he says there's a power within us. And you can use that power. And the use of that power is to bring about a balance between the two. And what happens is there's something about the human mind that wants to get something and be satisfied. And there's no such place. You have to continually work. And he reminded me one day about this wonderful poem of Rabindranath Tagore. Tagore, as you know, was a Nobel Prize laureate from India. And this was back in the 30s. It was called The Philosopher's Stone. Remember? The Philosopher's Stone is that balancing point. It is that power that we all have, that we have to constantly study to use and keep it in front. Well, in the Philosopher's Stone, now there may not be any such thing as a Philosopher's Stone, but there is that power, that presence, that force, that every religion, every spiritual system on the face of the earth believes in. It's a transforming power that dwells at the center of our own being. Well, he tells the story in this poem about how there's some sage. There was some sage who lived on the banks of the Ganges, you may recall. But there was this man who was, he was pious, but he was poor. But Ernest Holmes didn't believe in that. He felt that no one should be poor. You should all prosper in what you're doing. Now that's a very positive outlook. But what happened was this man had a dream, according to Tagore, and he dreamed of this sage who lived on the banks of the Ganges. And he was pious, but he was also impoverished. But he said he has found the Philosopher's Stone, and if you go to him, he'll solve your problem. Well, he dreamed that dream, and the next morning he thought about it. He said, "Well, who believes in a dream?" And then again, the very next night, he had that dream again. if you go to the bank of the Ganges and find this great sage, he'll solve your problem. And then he thought about that the rest of the day. He'd think about that. Well, the next night, he had the same dream again, 3 times in a row. And then he just got up and left and went to the Ganges and walked the bank, and sure enough, in that little humble cottage, there was the sage. And he was in meditation, according to Gore. And the man sat down next to him and just waited for him to come out of meditation. Finally, the sage came out of meditation, and he stood up and bowed before him and said who he was, where he came from. I have heard that you have the Philosopher's Stone, and I really need some help. And the sage said, well, you know, I did find the Philosopher's Stone, but I didn't have any need for it. He said, so I just threw it back in the sand. If you really want to find it, if you dig around here somewhere, you probably will find it. Well, with heart, in his hand, he just began to feverishly dig. And sure enough, according to Gore, the Philosopher's Stone popped up right out of the sand. And the man just went into ecstasy, began to dance with a stone in his hand. And then the thought came to him, well, he had this, and he threw it away. He must have something much greater than the Philosopher's Stone. So he threw it in the Ganges and bowed before the sage and said, give me something of this that you have that compared to the Philosopher's Stone is of nothing. And he tells that story to reveal that that's what happens to us. A genuine, authentic, spiritual experience can be overwhelming. An encounter with your own soul can be very overwhelming. And as a result, you turn totally to it. So some of the best minds in India have totally given themselves to the spiritual quest and still live in poverty. What Ernest Holmes wanted to do was to create a philosophy, a spiritual system that would agree with both your reason and your soul and create for you a balanced life between the two. That's the reason for the name religious science. Well, it reminds me of another story. Ernest was full of stories. The story was about this great king in India. And he had this vision of a kind of a fantasy land. He was the Walt Disney of ancient times. He wanted to create a beautiful, beautiful place. Well, so he called the greatest architect of the land, he was an architect of the gods, and he had access to the upper echelons of consciousness. So he called him, I called him in and told him what his vision was. I'd like to build a fantasy land. I want people to come here and really enjoy themselves. You want a swimming pool here, a theater here, all these things. And this great architect said, all right, I can do that. And he visualized that he could probably do that maybe in a year or so. And so he agreed to do it. But every 2 weeks or so, this king would think of something else that he wanted over here, something else over there. And he just kept on doing that. Every 2 weeks, he'd have another vision. And finally, he got worried. He thought, my God, I'm gonna die here. This is gonna last forever. So he called this Shiva in and told him his story. And Shiva said, well, don't worry about it. I'll take care of it. So he went back to work. Next morning, a little boy about 10 years old showed up at the gate of the kingdom, of the king's palace. And the guard said, yes, what can I do for you, little fellow? He said, well, I'm here to talk to the king. I have some things I want to tell him. He said, you want to talk to the king? And he was so fascinated by this little boy and his appearance. He said he was practically hypnotized as he was talking to the little boy. So he went to the king and he said, there's a little boy out here. Looks like he's about 10 years old. And he says he wants to talk to you. And I can't take my eyes off of him. He has phenomenal charisma. The king said, well, all right, bring him in. He brought him in. The little boy sat down very casually. He said, now, I've been told that you're creating a fantasy land and you're spending tons of money, which should be going to your people to help them out of their poverty. He says, you know, I've known many kings before you, and none of them ever did a thing like this. He said, did you say you knew many kings before me? He said, yes, I knew your father. And he described his father, what a wonderful man he was and how devoted he was to the welfare of the people. And he said, and I knew your father's father. And I knew your father's father's father. And the king was just amazed. And just about that time, an old man walked in. Big, hairy chest. It was like a wreath on his chest. He had empty space, you know, here. And the little boy said, hey, what's that thing on your head? Parasol. He said, well, I wear this parasol because, you know, it protects me from the sun and the rain. I don't have time to build a house or marry a wife or anything like that. He says, I'm just a man of few days. He said, well, what's that hair? What's that hair on your chest? He said, well, I'm a man of few days. He said, this hole here, he said, that's where the hair is falling off. One hair falls off every 100 years. Did you say every 100 years? Yes, every 100 years. And he says, there's only about 500 left, so I'm a man of few days. I don't have time to get involved with building a home and marrying a wife. And just like that, the old man disappeared. And then the boy disappeared. And the king was so overwhelmed by that experience, he decided and announced to his wife, he said, I'm going to call a halt to all this fantasy land. And he said, I'm going to renounce the kingdom, and I'm going to join a monastery. And she really became upset. So what happened was she called in the wise men. They had a wise man in the kingdom, and he was according to Thoreau, he was a wise man. And his wife told how disturbed she was about his attitude. He's going to renounce the kingdom, join a monastery. What's going to happen? He said, don't worry about it. I'll take care of that. So he called both the king and the wife into his place. And he told him how that as the king, as the leader of the country, you need to create a balance between eternity, between immortality, and the uncertainty of life. He said, you know, you have a very special place in the world, and the people look up to you as their guide. It's true, they don't need all this fantasy land. They need support. You know, he'd forgotten about the social affairs, about the need of the people. And so, as he talked, the Purana says that he began to recognize how important it is to bring about a balance in your life. Materiality on one hand, spirituality on the other. And once you do that, then you can embrace it with your whole self. Now, that concept was very strong with Ernest Holmes. That's why he created the school, to set a tone of constant research, continuous study, whereby that could happen in your life and in mine. And, you know, it reminds me, oh gosh, here I go again. It reminds me of another story. Another story, was this man who, well, he was a businessman, and he did very well, but he was a peevish man. He'd go into the bathroom to brush his teeth, and instead of toothpaste being squeezed, you know, at the end, someone would have squeezed it in the middle. Oh, that would just upset him. He would scold everybody, or he'd sit down to have a cup of tea, and put some sugar in. It turned out instead of sugar, it's salt. Oh, that would do it. It just ruined the whole day. Well, in a few days, he became concerned about his health, story goes, and he went to the doctor, and they examined him, and they told him he had terminal cancer, that he only had a few days to live, and they couldn't help him. Well, the story says that as he sit there in his hospital bed, he couldn't sleep. He saw the lights come on and the lights go off, and he saw them as individual souls coming into the world and going out. He saw himself in that process. And the next day, the doctors brought into question the research. They wanted to do more research. So they examined him again. And they found out that the exam had picked up nothing but psychosomatic symptoms, that he really didn't have cancer. And they released him. Well, when he got home, you know, it didn't matter where they squeezed the toothpaste. He was glad to see it was there. It didn't matter, you know, about salt or sugar. And his wife was so precious to him. And when he went to his office, he was the CEO. They said, it seems like he's all spaced out. Nothing seems to, he just wore his job like a loose coat. Everything was just okay. Well, that's the goal, according to Ernest Holmes. The goal of religious science, or centers of spirituality, is that we recognize that there's only one thing that we can give ourselves totally to, and that's what satisfies both the reason and the soul. And that's what your teaching can do for you if you totally embrace it. And I did. And I can never forget when he was near death. I walked into his room there on 6th and Lorraine. And I couldn't say when you die. I just said, well, when you leave. I just couldn't imagine him being dead. It was too awesome. And that's how it is, when you meet someone great like Ernest Holmes. It has such an impact on you that anyone else doesn't seem to compare. He's the one who told me. He said, there's a very fine line between idolatry and reverence. He was afraid people might slip into idolatry about him and lose sight of their own vision. He thought one of the greatest tragedies of life is to live your whole life and not have an original thought, not be able to make an original statement. And I said, Ernest, when you leave, I'm going to strike out on my own because I couldn't see anybody else. I just couldn't see anyone else in the organization. One day I was going to Santa Barbara to a ministers' conference. I don't know if they still have that or not. But it was in the Marriott Hotel. And so I was coming from Phoenix, and I drove right by 6th and Lorraine and got out and rang the doorbell. He came to the door. And of course, he was happy to see me. And I went, he said, are you going to the ministers' conference? I said, are you? He said, no, I can't make it. I said, well, I can't either. I want to be with you. Sorry about that. And that's what I told him. And he said, where are you going to go? And I didn't have a clue. I just said, well, Ernest, I'm going to follow my own soul. I have to find my own way. And he with disarming humility, which still brings tears to my eyes, he said, I wish I could go with you. Now, folks, I'm here to tell you, he has. And when you think about it, that example of continuously searching and continuously studying, even the Apostle Paul said, study to show yourself approved. But when you continue that path, that is the simple road. It's a long road, but this is published by Jeremy Tarcher, and it's in 20 languages now. And it just came out this last week. Have any of you seen it? Can you see that now? Yeah. It is so comprehensive. I mean, this book is only 150 pages because the Tarcher Penguin Random House people, they want something that's brief and yet comprehensive. And the longest paragraph here is less than 10 pages. I mean, the longest chapter. So anyway, it starts off like this, and then when you buy one, if you do, well, you can. It says, those who believe in self-healing will find the way to heal themselves. This is not the way of the miraculous, but something experienced within and brought down from above. When Christ said, your faith will make you whole, he was referring to something that occurs within ourselves. And it's that something which we're seeking to discover in this book. Well, I think we did. And now they've asked me to follow this up someday with another book. It's called The Aim of Life. That I'm about halfway through that already. And then after that, I'm going to write my magnum opus, which we call Universal Spirituality and Cultural Harmony. And I think that's the goal of our society, of our world. And I think it's coming. I believe, I believe in what is called the dynamic emergent evolutionary perspective. When you see that's how life is, the dynamic emergent evolutionary perspective, you see everyone as a creature of evolution. You see the possibility of transformation of everyone. In fact, Ernest Holmes says that one individual with God is totality, is completeness. And so that's how I wrote this whole thing. And I just heard from Horowitz. He says that my chapter on the overcoming the hostile forces saved his life. I talked to one of your people, Harv Bishop. Anyone? Do you know Harv Bishop? Anyone there? He's a writer for the Science of Mind magazine. He just interviewed me. And he said that my treatment on liberation from guilt was the greatest thing he ever read. Imagine that. And because it teaches simply that, way back in 1964, there was an ecumenical council by the Catholic Church in which they said that it's no longer right to say that the Jews are God killers. Now, this was a breakthrough. No longer should we say that, because he said they're not responsible for that. That should go upon the whole of mankind is guilty. Well, I point out in the book that that's a step forward to that the Jews are not God killers, but I said, but beyond that, they've placed the responsibility upon every man, on the whole of mankind. Well, in the book I say, time is coming when that will also be eliminated. Because, as Jesus said on the cross, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. So it was not the Jews that killed Christ. It was not the Roman Empire. It was ignorance. Ignorance is what killed him. So we have to learn in our life to separate ignorance from guilt, as Jesus did. And if we do, we'll find that the road, the simple road, is the road from ignorance to knowledge. And that's the path that I'm on and that you're on. And everyone who recognizes life as an evolutionary process is on. And if we can accept that fact, we can deal with everyone. You don't see anyone as guilty. You know, guilty is of no consequence. There's no place for guilt in spirituality. It's about grace. It's about love. It's about truth. It's about beauty. It's about love. It's about peace. And those are the values that we need to embrace as we go along. Well, it's good to talk with you. You must have some questions. I'm open to that.
Can you the mic over here so we can't do that? Okay. So I'll just talk into here. Dr. Harris, this is Christina. I have two questions for you.
All right.
One is would you talk, since you are the Bible professor now, would you talk a little bit about Culver Nelson, who was on the Bible, the Jesus Seminar, and how you met him and how that class came to be?
Oh, yes.
And one more question. Then would you also talk about how the distance program came to be when you and Lloyd Tupper and a whole bunch of other people decided to create this distance program for our ministerial students?
Oh, thank you. Those are wonderful questions. Well, first, Culver Nelson came to Phoenix. I've been with Culver for 40 years. Oh, maybe more than that. That's just a little while for me. Well, he came to Phoenix, and he rented Bud's barn. It was a brown barn, and he established his United Church of Christ. They call it the Beatitude Church, and he built it into the largest United Church of Christ in America. That's how good he is. And he and I used to study together. We've studied together for at least 40 years. And he was also a member of a group in Upper California, Northern California, the Jesus Seminar people. And that had about 150 scholars, biblical scholars, from the major universities in this country. In going through the scriptures, particularly the New Testament, but they went through the whole thing. And they decided what was authentic and what was maybe authentic and what was definitely not. And they used marbles. There was a red marble and a black marble. No way could Jesus say that. And it was, and I sometimes would go too, but he was the editor of the group. Well, I caught him at the peak of his career after we started the school here. You know, when I came here, I had just retired from Arizona State University, and I was a Mott Fellow. Mott was the person who actually built General Motors. There was one engineer, but he was the money behind it. And so he read a little article that I wrote on of the America way back, 50 years, 40 years ago or more. And he sent someone to Arizona State to find me and to offer me a scholarship for the PhD program at the University of Michigan. And that's how I went there, and he certainly took care of me. In fact, just as before I was graduating, he sent the PR man from their foundation to offer me a position that was the PR director of the Buick Motor Division at $150,000 a year and 2 new cars every year. And I told Steve, I said, Steve, I didn't do all this to become a car salesman. He says, do you want me to tell Mr. Mott that? And I said, well, you're the PR person. You put whatever spin on it that you think is appropriate. There's no way I'm going to take that job. And so he said, well, what do you want? I said, I just want to be a university professor somewhere in the southwest of the United States, because Michigan, I tell you, it's a cold place to live. and so 2 weeks later, I got a call from Las Cruces, New Mexico, from the educational dean there. He told me that they would like to give me a professorship and director of the Community Education Center, since that was my specialty. And so I flew in and accepted that at $28,000 a year. In fact, we never talked about money. I never asked him what the salary was. When I saw the school and could see the possibility, I said, oh, this is what I want. And then when I came back, he said, you and I never talked about a salary. I said, no, I'm not worried about that. I just like what you have here. He said, well, the salary is $28,000 a year. I said, fine, that's just fine. And then before that happened, Mrs. Mott, who Mr. Mott gave $100 million to marry him, I shouldn't have told you that, but anyway, but he did. And she called the foundation and said, can you send Obadiah out to see me? Because, that's when I had turned down the General Motors job. And she said, tell him I want him to take a walk in my garden. So I went out, and it was a beautiful garden, all enclosed. And she said, I want to commend you for turning down the General Motors position. And I want to congratulate you for taking the professorship at New Mexico State. Now, she said, my very best friend lives in Las Cruces, and I want you to meet her. And here's her phone number. Well, when I got there, I called her in my office. I said, Mrs. Stallman, this is Obadiah. She said, oh, she's like she was my mother. Oh, Obadiah, it's so good to hear your voice. I said, well, Mrs. Mott said I could come and see you. She said, oh, that would be wonderful. I said, well, when do you want to see me? She said, what about right now? So I said, okay. And I got in the car and found out where she was and drove out there. And of course, it was one of the most palatial places I'd ever seen. And up on a plateau, and we talked for about an hour. And she knew more about me than I knew myself. And it was amazing, all the things that Mrs. Mott had shared with her. Well, she told about even the airplane trips. When I was at New Mexico State, that I'll tell you the rest. What happened was she called her son in, and he was just a few years older than I. And he says, he showed me the whole estate. It took about 2 hours to see the estate. And then he turned to me upon a high plateau and says, now, Dr. Harris, what can we do for you? Well, I wasn't there to be done for, and I said, but then I looked there, and about about 5 miles of nothing but airplane. What do you call those places where you put the airplane? Hangar. One hangar after another. He had his own airport, his own Air Force. Those were his toys. I said, well, you could give me one of these airplanes. He said, that's a great idea. So he pushed a button and one of the pilots came running out. He said, how's that plane we just got in from Tulsa? It was a twin engine. And he said, oh, it's perfect. It's ready to go. He said, it's ready to go? He said, yes. He said, well, now it belongs to Dr. Harris. It's his. And he said, hey, you are his full-time pilot. Wherever he wants to go, 724. Wow. I'd given up $150,000 a year. Now I own a new airplane. And it was so beautiful to fly into Mexico. And so in about 2 years, well, at drop ad, I'd get another 50 students because they'd hear about all my stories. So I was offered a position in the same position at Arizona State University, and they doubled my salary. I didn't ask for it, they just did it. And that's when I met Nelson, Culver Nelson. He was one of the first people, I don't know why I did that, but I looked him up. He had the Church of Beatitudes. And you know what he did? The first thing he did, he was in a barn. I mean, a literal barn. And that's where he was preaching. And he saw how poorly the elderly were treated in Arizona. He built a beautiful home, a clinic, everything goes with it, to take care of senior citizens. That was on his heart. And when I met him, he already had a new church built. It's on the corner of 7th and Glendale. Beautiful place. And it was packed twice every Sunday to capacity. That's how effective he was. And he studied all the time. And I studied with him. We would go through the Bible. You know, my mother taught me to read when I was 3 years old, and we had read the Bible through before I was in school. She would read one line, and I would read the next. I found that if I read with her, I could read. Now that was the power of that woman. She would bring that knowledge to me. So I'd read the Bible by the time I was 5.5. And do you know that the characters in the Bible were more important to me? They were my heroes. They were more significant to me than celebrities or athletes or anything like that. They became real to me. And I found that studying with Nelson was just such a reward because he had the insight into the inner meaning of the scripture. He was truly a scholar. And he's still teaching that course today for you. And I'm so proud of him. But I caught him at his very peak. You've never heard someone talk as he talks. I mean, it's fast. I don't know where he gets it, but he talks fast and he teaches fast. And he went through the whole Bible. And I'm so grateful to him. He's a great teacher. And then What was that other question?
The distance.
Oh, yeah, the beginning. Oh my. Well, you know, Lloyd Tupper. Do you know Lloyd Tupper?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Well, he's a wonderful guy. He called me over to a board meeting with Holmes Institute and told me that they would like for me to develop a series of talks, of curriculum in consciousness studies. And you know what consciousness is. Consciousness is the knowing factor that runs in and through all levels of human experience and beyond. Now, isn't that a quick answer? Well, anyway, so I said, "What?" And you know what happened? It was so wonderful. I had already started doing that here at the Philosophical Research Society. When I came here, they had about 11 board members, and they offered me to be the CEO, to take Manly Hall's place. And I said, no, I don't think anybody could do that, take his place. He was so prolific. He wrote about 150 books. Well, you know, I told more than I know in this 150 pages. So, you know, I said, sure, I'll do that. And, but I said, I should tell you that I've started doing that already. And what I saw when they asked me to be the CEO, and I wasn't quite ready. I was still just at the edge of my full retirement at ASU. So I turned it down, and then they called me back. The board did. Colonel Johnson was acting president. He was shot down in World War II 5 times and walked away every time. He had a charmed life. And so I came back. They asked me to come back again. I thought they'd found someone, and I thought, well, you know, they wonder what I think. But what happened was they asked me to again. And so there was an old man, 92 years old, was a Tibetan Buddhist, and he was just next door to a saint. His eyes were just crystal clear. And he looked at me straight in the eye. He says, Obadiah, you are the man that should take this. You have the background in wisdom studies. One of my primary background was wisdom studies in all the religions of the world. And is there any condition under which you would take it? And he looked at me with almost in a playful way. And I couldn't quite take that. Something about his presence that just, you know, would hit your heart. And I said, yeah, there is one condition. And that's that if all of you board members resign and let me appoint my own. Whoa. When I realized what I'd said. You know, when I realized what I'd said, I was embarrassed. And I said, well, I think with that, I'd better go and leave it up to you. So I walked out, and I felt embarrassed all the way home. And on the airplane, I said to myself, Obadiah, why did you say that? And the voice within me said, you didn't, we did. And I thought, you know, I need a psychiatrist. I mean, you know, I'm asking questions and I'm answering them. So when I got home, I told Jeannie, she asked me, how'd it go? And I told her just what I just told you. And she said, well, I don't think you'll be hearing from them. And that's what I said, well, I hope not, because I was still embarrassed by it. And I couldn't believe I had said that. And so in about 2 weeks, Colonel Johnson called. He says, Obadiah, did you mean what you said the other night? That if we all resigned, that you would consider taking it? Well, I said, Colonel, I have felt many times that I owe you people an apology. I shouldn't have said that. He said, no, you don't owe us an apology. Those were words of wisdom. That's the only way it'll work. So please come back and listen to us resign. I said, well, all right. So I flew back over and they resigned. And I realized I couldn't take it like that. So I asked him to stay, and the old man, 92 years old, to stay, and a young man named John Pillsbury. He's the original doughboy. and so they stayed with me. And you know, I called Nelson. One of the first persons I called was Reverend Nelson. I told him what happened, and he laughed, and he said, well, he said, one thing is sure, you're supposed to be there. And so he flew over, and we talked about it, and I asked him, you know, to do that. And then when Tupper asked me to do that, I could see it all coming together, that I could do for you what I was doing for this place. And you know, when just before Manly Hall died, he put a time capsule in the cornerstone of the auditorium here. And the 50 years was up in 2009, because he put it there in 1950. Was that we were on 59? In 59. And the first paper that fell out of that time capsule said, what I envision for the future is a wisdom school that can be nationally accredited, and that people can take it without leaving home. And that's what I was doing right then with religious science, or with Holmes Institute and this place. And that's how they both came out at the same time. And so I was hiring teachers, and those are the teachers that you have. They love you people, and they love the Holmes Institute, all of them, and the way you treat them. And we're continuously, we now have, and I've talked to Reverend Tillotson about this. We found all these inquiries. We're getting all kinds of inquiries, and I'm sure you do. But over half of the people don't even have a bachelor's degree. So we decided, okay, well, we'll write one up for that. So now we're offering a bachelor's completion program, and people are signing up for that. Oh, I've got something to tell you, Reverend Tillotson. Last week I got a call from DEAC, the accreditation agency, and because I had called in and I said, you know, we have people that want a PhD. And in fact, two of your people who are now the heads of, you know, you came back together, you know, back in the 50s.
Right, you're right.
It's split apart. It's called International Religious Science or something like that, and United Church of Religious Science. Well, they came back together. Those two men invited me to lunch up the street. And what they wanted was if I would agree to develop a PhD program. Well, I called the company, the association, and told them we need, and they don't offer a PhD. They just go to a master's. And I said, to go further, we need a PhD program. And I'm willing to develop it. And do you know what, Reverend? She said, fine. She talked to the head, and she said, tell Dr. Harris, we will do it. And what we're going to do, said we're going to go before the Board of Education in Washington, and we will make you a pilot school, and you can start your PhD program. Well, did that make me happy? Because, I'm in my final days now, and I can do that. And, that'll sort of be I think, one of the last things I can do for the glory of God. I wonder, do you have any other questions? I seem like I've rambled from Dan to Beersheba.
So we have a question. If you will come and wave hello to Dr. Harris over here at the camera, and then say your name and then ask your question.
Do what?
They're going to wait.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Hi, Dr. Harris. My name is Sherry Johnson.
Yeah.
And my question is, when can I apply to that PhD?
Did you hear that? Can you say that again?
Yeah, go over.
Oops. My question is, when can I apply for that PhD program?
Oh, well, that'll be very soon. And in fact, she promised me that we will get that in late 16, right out of the Department of Education. Isn't that great? Well, yeah. So just send it. The application will be. We'll make them up here, and you can do it there as well. Because I feel that you are a part of me. Sorry about that, but that's how I feel.
I'm sorry. You have to speak into this mic and wave to Dr. Harris over.
Hi, Dr. Harris.
Hi,
this is Kathy Homara. I just want to say that we're all very much looking forward to see you, and you're dearly missed. That's all. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate that. My wife, Jeannie, you can't see her, but she's sitting right here. You can't see her. Oh, I know this fellow somewhere. Here's Jeannie. She's my co-founder. Now, can you see her? There she is. And this will be in late 16. So Reverend Children, you and I will stay in contact, and I'll let you know exactly when those applications are ready. And one time when at the same time those two men asked me to do that, what was her name? You might know. She's a practitioner, I think a teacher. She gave me 50 names from among you to call. I want to know if I could just do a little polling. And everyone I call and told them about these gentlemen who asked me to do it, they said, count me in. Every one of them. They want to be a part of that. So you have a renaissance on your hands when that happens. And some of the older ministers may get jealous because they may be too good for them.
Hey, Dr. Obadiah, this is Masando Hiraoka. How's it going?
It's going good. How are you?
Good.
You look great.
Thanks, you do too.
Oh, thanks.
So my question is I loved what you said about Ernest and bringing a balance between materiality and spirituality and soul and reason. And I'm wondering if you could give us some examples of how he's done that.
Yes. Oh, yes. In fact, that was a sort of the underlying theme of his life, as he told me. And how he's done that is to not do away with the doctors, not discard their, if you break a leg, you need a doctor to set it. But you can't afford to put the doctor in limbo, and that, to use his words, but also at the same time, stay in touch with the spirit within you who has spiritual power. And he says, that's the greater power. And you should always keep that in mind, that as he says here somewhere, I just read it, about healing is the discovery of the divinity within you. And isn't that wonderful to realize that this is within us? And he when he says that, Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is within you, that's the divine. See, the soul is perfect, but the body, the emotions are not. And that's why you have to constantly work to bring about that harmony. And he tried to touch on all that phase, and I think in the Science of Mind textbook, which is, not necessarily up to date right now, but it still touches those central points, and it's good to keep it. And maybe someday we'll write a new one. Who would dare that? So Obadiah would. His idea was to keep the spiritual part in the front, but at the same time to recognize that emotionally, physically, socially, politically, in the totality of life, there is need for this dynamic, emergent, evolutionary outlook. And I'm going to write a book on, I think I may have mentioned it, on universal spirituality and cultural harmony. And to this gentleman who just asked this question, that book will be full of those kind of examples of how we can do that, in a universal way, including the totality. It's interesting to notice how that once you touch that balance, that once you touch the soul and it comes to the front, you see, the ego is divisive, is separative. The soul is unitive and brings together that harmony. And that's why meditation is so important, that you every day touch that and start from there, So once we recognize the soul as the harmonizing agent in our lives, and reason is that which keeps you in touch with your physical needs, your financial needs, your emotional needs. And that alone has the capacity to bring about that harmony. And that's why in Science of Mind, there's so much emphasis on meditation. That's the approach to it. And when you meditate, it's good to recognize this reconciling force that the soul is in your nature. Try to learn how to bring it to the front by giving it attention. And you'll find as you do this You'll see weaknesses that you have, and it will not be disheartening. You will not, feel guilty. You'll know that this is, you and I are the only creature that is created unfinished. And our task is to finish our own creation. The human being is the only one like that. You and I are pretty special. Are you listening? So I think that if you just see that as Ernest saw it, he saw the soul as perfect. He saw it as the organizing agent, the harmonizing force in our lives. But he saw that the reason was there that had to be satisfied too. And that way you can embrace it with your whole being. Isn't that what we want to do? That's what I want to do. And I see you as part of me, and me as part of you. It's a wonderful group. Did that help, my friend?
We have about 15 minutes before we take a break if you want to use Dr. Harris's time that he's agreed to. So please use him and ask questions.
Yeah, feel free. We still have some time. That's all I have is time.
Hello, Dr. Harris.
Hi.
It's such a pleasure to get to hear you. I've never taken your classes yet, but this is so enjoyable. My name is Jane Burnett, and I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
You spoke about the balance, that the meditation and our spiritual practices bring a balance to the sacred and profane, basically. And you talk about it being in balance. Now, I know most of the reason I'm in these studies is because it feels so good. And you talk about balance, but do you not recommend studying it and immersing yourself in it to the point that you're overbalanced into spirit? Because it seems like that would just feel so much better.
Well, it might feel better, but I think that the tendency that Ernest talks about to me when I was a young fella was that the tendency is to go to an extreme. See, in India they went to extreme, and it's still that way. Some of the best brains of India gave themselves totally to the spiritual, and that's not good. It's not healthy.
So that's where that impoverished side came from, where you're just oblivious to the physical, sort of.
Right, and there's no, it's like the man who threw the philosopher's stone away, threw it into the Ganges River, because he was so overwhelmed by this spiritual experience. And so we have to walk a balanced life between reason and spirit. But it's all right. It's just that when you have an authentic spiritual experience, you do feel overwhelmed. When I went to Pondicherry, if I can, you got a moment? Well, when I went to Pondicherry, the mother Mira was head of it then.
I know.
She put me into Aurobindo's room where he first stayed. As a refugee, you might say, as a spiritual refugee. And I had just meditated for an hour. Now, before I went to Pondicherry, I couldn't meditate for an hour. I could never meditate more than, say 10 or 15 minutes. But she just put her finger on an organ note, and these were all adepts at meditation. About 1,000 of them. Wow, that's really a wind at your back. And so I went into a trance. It just took me out. And I still don't know how I got back to my bedroom. I've completely forgotten it. But I got back, and I got under the mosquito net. And then I saw this light forming, coming through the wall. And it formed into like a ball of white light and came right up to my bedside. And it was Aurobindo, the spirit of Aurobindo. And he said, I'd like to take you out of your body and have you meet some of my friends. And you've been dead for 10 years. Hope this doesn't scare you. Well, and so I just consented, and there was no voice. It was just mental. And I went to this place above the earth, and there were several people there. It was like a giant lotus tree in my vision. And they said, you know, you have a great teacher, and you've had other great teachers. But if you ever need any help, you really feel you need help, if you call on us, we'll help you. Still there?
Yes.
Well, then he brought me back, standing over my bed. He said, now, Obadiah, don't try this again by yourself. He said, don't do it unless I help you. Well, I was perfectly willing for him to help me. And I was really overwhelmed by that experience. But I remembered the words of Ernest Holmes. Stay in balance. Continually keep working. It's never over, Obadiah. It's never over. You think about that. It's never over. And that's why he was constantly searching. And that's why he would pay people, I think I mentioned that, he would pay people who were researchers to research things to make sure that he was contemporary with the scientific truth. That's the kind of teacher you had.
Thank you, Obadiah.
Thank you.
Hi, Obadiah. This is Kim Kaiser, the dean here.
All right, Jim.
I'm going to ask you a question I asked you about 15 years ago. Same question.
I don't know if my memory is that good.
This is the question. You got a chance to study with Ernest Holmes. What was he like as a teacher? What was it like to study with him?
Well, I thought that in studying with him, I was right at the fountain. And that's why, it was kind of overwhelming because I couldn't see anyone else. I couldn't listen to anyone else. I just wanted to ask him. And he always, he had such a natural joy. Are you aware of this? When you have spontaneous joy, you're immortal. Because God is joy. You know how creation happened? According to the Upanishads? Out of the fullness of joy, in the heart of reality, the universe sprang into existence. So the kind of joy that Ernest had, and I saw him when he'd think of Hazel, and I could see the little cloud that would come over him. And in a few seconds, he'd be happy again. He missed her. And he loved her. But I like being with him. Even then, I wanted to see that sorrow, and I wanted to see him come out. So I really couldn't listen to anyone else. He gave a class on the life divine, which is the magnum opus of Aurobindo. This was in the last few months of his life. And someone came up to him and said, Ernest, don't you think that your teaching of the life divine by Aurobindo undermines the church? And you know what he said? I was there. He said, I am the church. Well, that was the end of that. He told me one time, he said, because he was worried about it, and I may have mentioned this, he said, there's just a fine line between idolatry and reverence. And he says, and those who cross that line seldom ever come back. So he didn't want you to be intoxicated with him. He wanted you to be intoxicated with the truth. If there be anything good, if there be anything true, if there be anything beautiful, Scripture says, think on these things. And, when you have a dynamic leader like that, you have to be careful about that.
Is there any last words of wisdom you would like to leave us with before we complete this amazing sacred time?
What I'd like to do is turn to the back of my book, this new book, and just, I'll begin here. In this book, I recommend that those who really need help, that there are 3 paths. But I turn to psychic love, which I recommend bhakti, the yoga of love. And I found that those persons whom we deem happiest, those peaceful and enlightened, have entered into a communion with the love of God, which includes all and excludes none. They see God in all men, in all things, and love him wherever he is and in all that he does. He who loves God in this way has no fear, and being fearless is the victor over illness. Such persons can bravely face and overcome every misfortune and illness, because in these two they see the hand of God shaping, molding, and purifying them, leading them to an earthly perfection and an immortal life. They're like spiritual magnets which attract others to them. They uplift the spirits and heal the bodies of those who associate with them. A veritable halo is around their faces. In all their ways, they are a force for the good, righteousness, and healing mankind in the New Testament. Is there any among you suffering? This is James, the brother of Jesus. Is there any among you suffering? Let him pray. Is any among you sick? Let him call for the elders of the church and let them pray over him, anointing him with oil in the name of the Lord. And the prayer of faith shall save the sick, and the Lord will raise him up. Pray for one another that you may be healed. Did you hear that? Pray for one another that you may be healed. Well, the prayer of a righteous man avails much. So as James says, to be healed, there must be an expression of a prayer offered up to God, and this expression of prayer must be for others so that you may be healed yourself. Why is it that you cannot be healed unless you pray for others? It's because the individual can be perfected only if humanity is perfected. That's why Jesus died on the cross. That's why Buddha turned his back on the threshold of nirvana, saying he would not cross it until he could take all men with him. As Paul said, we are members one of another. If one member is sick, the whole body is ill. What is an epidemic if it's not a sickness of humanity? and not an individual disease. Now, I want to close with this. We pointed out that, that such divine love is is a true expression of healing, how it's possible to express it. So I'm suggesting in this book, which has gone all over the world now, you pray to God in this way. Take a listen. Let divine peace and the knowledge of truth, be given to us all. Let the vision of all men be clear. Bring quiet and calm into our lives. Dispel our needless anxieties. Let us cease to consider ourselves only. Let us find the bliss of dedicating ourselves to the purposes of the divine will. Let the glory of God be beautiful and his love expressed in all humanity. Let God's kingdom on earth continue to unfold until it's expressed and manifested in the lives of all, and in the world in purity and perfection, now and forever. That's my prayer.